Hi everyone, Howard Gearhauser here with my dad, Dr. Richard Gearhauser. In today's video episode, we are going to talk about how to diversify your gut flora and some research that's showing the more diversified your gut flora is as you get older, the longer you can actually live. This is something that we've talked about in the past. However, in our modern society, in our modern environments, our gut flora seems to get less and less diversification as we get older due to antibiotics, not being outside, and a whole bunch of other reasons. So we wanted to touch on this and give you some practical tips on what you can do to diversify your microbiome. So Dad, can we start with talking a little bit about this study that you came across that talks about the increase in longevity as it relates to the diversification in gut flora?
Yeah, well, first I'll just mention or kind of define what we're talking about the microbiome. So it's important to know that the human body is really an ecology all of its own. We know we have an ecology, on the continents and in the oceans, and there's the world ecology. Well, we have an ecology ourselves. So our body that exists, in this physical form is an ecology of many different organisms. So one of the big parts of that is called our microbiome, which are organisms that live inside us and on top of us. So we have organisms everywhere. We have trillions of these. In fact, I mean, it's hard to know for sure the exact number, but once they were able to identify things through genetic testing, which has been relatively recent, that they can go in and check the DNA and the RNA. And what they found is there's way more critters, on us and in us than we ever imagined. And so overall, that's called the microbiome. There is a big part of the microbiome that is in our gut. So the gut microbiome's kind of been a big area of research, but there are microbiomes everywhere. They're on our skin, they're in our brain. So they're not just in our gut. This is something that is just now being understood, but it's thought that our modern environment is really hard on the microbiome. And one is our messing up our circadian rhythms with artificial light. The artificial electromagnetic fields are thought not to be healthy, not only for us, but for our microbiome. And we have seen studies correlating low microbiome diversity with more disease. So it's been associated with diabetes, with obesity, and with most of the diseases of aging. So if you have a disease, you're more likely to have less diversity in your microbiome. And they've also found out certain critters will be higher in people that say are obese. There'll be a certain critter that's higher in those people versus people of their ideal weight. There'll be changes. So, but talking about the study that you just mentioned that was just published recently was looking at Chinese people that lived to be, they took two groups, people that lived to be 90 to 100 and also people that lived to be greater than 100, and they checked their gut microbiome for its diversity. So what they found, surprisingly, was the gut microbiome of these elderly Chinese people that made it to 90 and 100 plus had more diversity even than a young person. Whereas the average person in the population, every year, their diversity goes down. So here we're seeing the exact opposite. Here are these people that live, they're in the top 99.9% of the population, tiny segment of the population makes it to 100. Well, these people that make it to 100 have way more gut diversity than you would expect. In fact, they're even have more diversity than a younger person. So this is kind of exciting. Now it is just a correlation. In science, they always say correlation does not equal causation. But it's pretty exciting to see. Now, these elderly people tended to be more connected with nature than probably the average person, say, living in a city. And of course, someone that's 100 years old was here before the technology boom and all these new things that, like I say, EMF and toxins, we keep getting more and more toxins everywhere. They had less exposure to that, but these old people were somehow resistant to that effect of cutting off their diversity. Now, it could be they're so old, they're not into the cell phone, and they're still eating basic foods that maybe aren't loaded with all the crap that our modern processed foods have today. But this is exciting. It's something as simple as having greater gut diversity. And it's also been shown in kids. Kids with greater gut diversity have better health. Kids that grow up on farms tend to have better gut diversity and they have better health. So it correlates at any age, but here we see that, wow, something kind of astounding. These old people have the microbiome diversity of a young person.
So one interesting thing that we were talking about the other day as it relates to the microbiome diversity was a lot of people think that it's highly correlated with diet and supplements, like taking a probiotic, eating fermented foods and whatnot. But you were mentioning a study that they did. I can't remember exactly what it was, so you can elaborate. But essentially, they took a village and they swapped out their kind of healthy, natural diet with junk food, and were measuring how that affected the gut flora diversification, and that there wasn't a big change, meaning and implying that maybe a lot of this is more environmental than nutrition. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, well, it's always out there in functional medicine that, you want to you want to take in the probiotics and the prebiotics. So the probiotics are the actual species themselves, whether a fungi or a bacteria. And then the prebiotics are like fertilizer for them. So stuff that you eat that we don't digest well, so it tends to be available for the flora. So probiotics and prebiotics, and those are things that can be done. What was interesting, they did a study of a hunter-gatherer people there aren't many of those left on the planet, but one is the Hadza. So the Hadza, the hunter-gatherers, they had them continue their life in their village, but they fed them junk food. And surprisingly, like Cokes and, McDonald's hamburger or whatever, but surprisingly, their gut flora didn't change. So yeah, that's important. But getting back to those old people, I just wanted to mention a little further, there was also an Italian study. So they found this in those Chinese people, and they did a similar study on the 100-year-old Italians, and they found the same thing. So what is it? Is it in the gut flora is one of the key things. Well, one of the key things that we know in functional medicine is, and this is typically, your mainstream medicine just doesn't have a clue about this, unfortunately. They don't follow the science. They don't know anything outside of the drugs or their surgeries. But basically, these bacteria make the short chain fatty acids, and the short chain fatty acids that the bacteria produce, these are a nutrient for the epithelial cells that line our gastrointestinal tract. So these short chain fatty acids that we don't make, the bacteria make them. So if we don't have the bacteria, then our gut lining is undernourished. Now, these short chain fatty acids also are anti-inflammatory. So we know that chronic inflammation is kind of a root issue with most diseases of aging. So here we know what the gut does, but again, it's kind of theory and it's like correlation, but to try to get an idea of, is this causation or not. You can look at another species, because to do that study in humans, like a randomized controlled trial, well, you got to wait till they see who lives to be 100 years or not. You know, no one's going to be alive when the study's completed 100 years from now. So you can't do studies like that in humans, but you can do that in animals that have a much shorter lifespan, or you can look at biomarkers of aging and have a shorter study to see. But they took a species called the African turquoise killifish. So this killifish, they looked at their microbiome in their gut, and they looked at having more diversity versus less diversity and doing that on purpose. And they found that the ones with the lower diversity, they lowered their diversity on purpose. They had a greatly, significantly increased biomarkers of aging, which points to this might be causal. So something like as simple as, and I'm not saying it's so simple to do, I mean, taking probiotics and prebiotics is one thing. What we recommend is do our top 10 biggest things that can impact your health. You can look at that video. We have a 10 lifestyle factors that give you the most bang for the buck, because circadian mechanism is really important. Sun exposure is really important. Grounding is really important. So these things, we feel, you know, it's not been studied necessarily, but look at that tribe study. When they kept their environment of being barefoot and being in the sun and wading in the river, but still eating junk food, the gut flora was still good. So I don't think it's necessarily diet. It's the other things we do wrong. Now, we do a lot of things wrong with our diet, but I think the biggest thing is toxins in our diet. Our diet, in a way, is just we take the protons and electrons out of the molecules in our diet. And I think the biggest problem with that is they can be out of sync with our environment. In other words, the sugar molecule was created on the equator and you live on the pole. Eating that, you know, might be a quantum mismatch. You know, so I say try to eat close to your latitude, what's in season at your latitude. I think that's a good way to go, just to follow Mother Nature. Again, that's theory and speculation, but it makes sense to me when we know that the sun programs the electrons in our atom, and the power of that sun is reflected in what state that electron is put in by that sunlight, depending on, you know, where it was. Was it at the equator? Was it at 50 degrees north latitude? Was it at the pole? This all has an implication on how much energy that electron, as it moves up or as its spin changes. So I think that's something we preach, even though it's speculation, but it's following nature's rules. And we think that is going to eventually be figured out in science. You know, it takes a long time. This stuff is just slowly coming out, but it's coming out faster and faster. We're getting more and more research showing us these quantum effects are important.
Well, and to that point, it's like nature and the sun being a part of nature kind of sets the energetic programming. So when you mention something like eating sugar, if you live on a pole, maybe that wouldn't be in season or wouldn't make sense. But if you're getting out in nature, you're setting the programming to where you'll naturally kind of choose what you're supposed to eat that's going to amplify your energy. Because when you're living in a higher energy state, you can easily identify things that keep you there, that help you elevate, and also things that drag you down and drain your energy from a dietary standpoint, also other things that you're doing. So that's something important to realize. In order to get your programming set properly, you have to get out in nature, you have to get out in the sun, you have to get electrically connected to the earth. That way you kind of have the blueprint of what to do. If you're inside all of the time, you're not going to know, you know, and your energy state's pretty low, you're not going to know what's going to elevate it versus drain it, because you're already at the bottom. So if you're at the bottom and you're doing things to keep you at the bottom, it's just going to seem the same. So it's important to get that energetic programming dialed in, make sure you're in a high energy state. That way you actually have a gauge on what to do, what inputs to consume. And I think that this is directly connected with the microbiome too. If you can get your programming set, then your microbiome also has its programming set because it's in connection, it's in sync. So the more we don't follow that programming and get away from it, the more problems we're going to have. The individuals in the villages in China who are living really long, yeah, they probably don't have this modern environment. They've lived their lives on the land, eating the natural diet, having that programming dialed in, and haven't succumbed to all of our new modern exposures. So that's just something to take into consideration. And as my dad mentioned, we have a video that talks about our 10 best things that you should do to get this programming dialed in. It's really important that you're implementing those things. Then all this other stuff will fall into place, is what we found. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, there is new research linking either having low diversity or an unbalanced diversity to frailty in old people. So, you want to be frail. No one wants to be frail when they're old. So living to 100, what good is that if you're in a bed? It might be good, but it's also correlated to Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and inflammation. So it's not just having a lower diversity, but it's also having what's called dysbiosis, meaning the critters that aren't supposed to be there are there. And so that also can cause problems. And that's what functional medicine docs a lot of times focus on. But I think what they're missing is like our top 10 things that you need to do. They don't know that information. So this is something that, we're trying to tell the world that you want to go further, deeper to get to the root cause. Everybody thinks the root cause is diet and exercise. And it's not really the root.
Well, the root cause is programming. It's like, what programming are we following? Are we following nature's programming, or are we following kind of the man-made environment programming? And like we talk about in a lot of our videos, this matrix and this subconscious programming. Which are we buying into? Which are we believing to be true? If you get back to nature, your programming is going to be dialed in. You don't have to worry about a lot of these other things. So just start doing those 10 things that we recommend, and all this will fall into place. And as my dad mentioned, it's not about living to 100 necessarily. It's about having high quality of life and being happy and low stress and fulfilling your purpose. So just remember that. That's why we're here, is to do that, not to be stressed out, living in fear, living in this artificial environment that keeps us totally disconnected from the programming that we actually need. So go do those things. I'll throw a link into it. One other thing too, if you want to help yourself kind of get reprogrammed into what nature wants, into your purpose, and want to get your health optimized as well, we do have some spots open in our program. You can check out customhealthprogram.com if you are interested in learning more about that. If not, go do the free stuff, because we have a lot of free stuff on YouTube. Anything you want to add before we sign off on this one?
No, I think we got to think of that gut flora as being really important. And the best way to deal with it is, as Howard mentioned, go to the underlying cause. But I just would like to mention, we focus so much on light. And one big source of light for our health is the light emitted by the microbiome. So that research is in its infancy, but bacteria release way more light than our cells. We're eukaryotes. So eukaryotes are more complex organisms, and bacteria are prokaryotes. And the prokaryotes emit a lot more light than eukaryotes, but we also emit light. We emit biophotons, and that's what bacteria emit, but they emit way, way, way more than we do. And we need that light. It programs our immune system. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship that's critically important. And the studies, always bear this out. So this isn't speculation.
Well, check out our other videos, implement the stuff, share it if you like it. Please subscribe. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks, Dad. See you on the next video.